Today we are very happy to have our next guest on the GrowthChat, and it's Jeanet Bentzen from the University of Copenhagen, where she is an associate professor. She's also the executive director of ASREC, the Association for the Study of Religion, Economics and Culture. And Jeanet and I got to know each other 10 years ago. I had the great pleasure to be on her PhD committee in the year 2011. And today, Jeanet will talk about her paper in the Economic Journal that's entitled The Pre-Reformation Roots of the Protestant Ethic. Welcome, Jeanet.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting.
So let us maybe start by you telling us a short summary of this particular paper and what the historical background is. Why would you look before the Protestant Reformation, so 600, 700, 800 years ago?
Yeah, so this paper, let me put it first in a very broader picture. It's part of this tradition that traces the roots of modern economic growth. What we base our story on is this famous sociologist, Max Weber. He argued that Protestants had this particular cultural appreciation of hard work and thrift, and he called it the Protestant ethic. And he argued that this was one of the main drivers of modern capitalism. And so in our paper, we test the hypothesis that what Weber termed the Protestant ethic actually had like this pre-Reformation origin in the order of the Cistercian monks. And these Cistercians, they were an offshoot of the Benedictine order, whom they thought they were getting way too lax in their practice. And the Cistercians, they wanted to return to this rule of Saint Benedict. And this is a time where you return to hard manual labor and refrain from consumption of such unnecessary goods as arts or pets. And some historians thought this was to then have more time for prayer. But anyway, these Cistercians here, they were hardworking and they were thrifty. And these are values that were very similar to what Weber termed the Protestant ethic. And some historians even call the Cistercians the Protestant ethic without Protestantism. So they were really outlined as having these values here. And the Cistercians, they were established around or in 1098 in the year 1098 in the town Citeaux in France, and they spread across Europe from there. And by 1128 they reached England and continued to spread until all monasteries were dissolved, closed down by the king around 1540 when the Protestant Reformation hit. And then what we find then, if I should just say very briefly what we find, and we can discuss more. So we find that these areas with Cistercian monks, they were historically richer, and they are more likely to hold these particular values of hard work and thrift today, 900 years after their establishment.
So we are talking here about the period before the Reformation, which started in the early 16th century, and you talk about monks. And so a question arises, so how did whatever the monks did inside a monastery then reach the general population? Why would it matter outside the walls of the monastery?
Yeah, this is important. So usually when we think of cultural transmission, one main mechanism is that cultural values, they are transmitted from parent to child. So if I find hard work crucial, I'll try to transmit this value to my children consciously or unconsciously. But as the Cistercian monks, they were monks in general, they don't get children usually. So instead their cultural values, so we find in the history books that their values, they might have spread through all the people working in the monasteries, Some that were not religious, or well, everybody were religious, but some that did not have to obey these Cistercian rules. They could have kids and families. They moved around in society. So these people, they were, for example, peasants working as agricultural labor. There was servants in these monasteries, and another channel was also that outside the monasteries there were people having marketplaces, and there's thus like engaging with the monasteries, or the people hired in the monasteries, and thus they could then be treated, as we call it in economics, with these values by the Cistercians here. We then, in the beginning, we had a bit. Sorry.
Oh, no, you go. Sorry, interrupted you.
So in the beginning, we had a bit of a hard time believing or thinking about. So these were not so many monks, right? It's 60 monasteries spread out across England, but we then tried to formulate a theoretical model, making it plausible or unplausible that these monks could spread. And we can see so at this time in history, we are at a point in time before the fertility transition. So people who became richer, they could have more surviving babies. And so if these families here, they were treated with the values for hard work and thrift, they were more able to earn incomes, and thus they would then have more babies. So in this period of 400 years where the monasteries were in England, we can see that it's really plausible that they could spread these values to quite large chunks of societies over this very long period of time. That's what we have in mind.
In your paper, you also use the work of historians to locate the monasteries in England, right? Why is this important?
Yes, so for our analysis, we show that these Cistercians, these areas with the Cistercians, they had higher population growth, a measure of economic growth. But in order for us to interpret that this is an impact of the Cistercians, it should not be the case that this is just because the Cistercians were good at choosing places that were later to become rich. So we want to somehow be a little bit like the scientist in the lab, where we could randomly put more Cistercians in some areas than others. Of course, we cannot do that, but we can. Economists, we call this natural experiment, where we let nature somehow do this randomization, and that's where we use the work of historians. They have they argued that or they describe history as such that the Cistercians, when they came to England, they couldn't just locate anywhere. So they were given a spot by the king, and he gave them a spot in his own forest. And that's what we then use as this random allocation of the Cistercians. Of course, areas with more forest might somehow affect history later on. We can control for that and instead use that you just need some forest in your county for you to be more able to, or likely to get a Cistercian monastery. So, but in short, this is really to play the scientist in the lab and randomizing these monasteries. And then we can then draw these causal conclusions.
Yeah, so we're talking about 900 years. How did you find the data? What data did you use and how did you find it?
Yeah, so this is exactly why we started looking at England, because England has these amazing data on historical matters going very far back. They were really meticulous in how they collected and saved their data. So we have data from history books on population densities going back to to the years, the early years of the establishment of the Cistercians around year 1400, 1600, and 1800. We have these data, and we can then combine that with another cool database that we found on these Cistercian monasteries in general in England. We found this database with 766 monasteries spread all over England, and we can then calculate for each county how large a share of total monasteries were Cistercian monasteries, so that we are not just treating you with any kind of religion. We're treating you with Cistercian religion as a share of all others. We can then also do these checks of whether it's other monasteries, for example, the Benedictines or stuff like that. And we see that it's only the Cistercian monasteries that have this large impact on growth. So that's one part of the data. Of course, these historic data, they didn't go out and ask people for their cultural values at this time and note it down, unfortunately. But we can then use current data from surveys across Europe to see whether, so since it's cultural values, and cultural values, as I talked about, they spread across generations, and the hypothesis is then that if they were treated with these cultural values back in history, we may even see it today. And that's what we see. We have these surveys of 56,000 individuals in the entire Europe today, and we can see that, and then we combine that with location of Cistercian monasteries across Europe. We digitize these old maps to do that, and we can then see that areas with more Cistercian monasteries back in history, they are more likely to have these values for hard work and thrift today.
Wow, amazing. So you would say that Max Weber, who talked about the Cistercians, in fact, he mentioned them as precursors of Protestant trades, that he was right. So you confirm some 100 years later that Max Weber had an idea that bears out in the data, right?
Yes and no. We confirm that these values are important for economic growth. But we do not confirm that they had their origin in the Protestant Reformation. They in fact had their origin 400 years later, and we can actually check this a little bit. We can see that when we then look at across Europe, when we then kick out the areas that were hit harder by the Protestant Reformation, we actually see that our numbers, they become more precise, so the effects increase. But that's actually also a little bit of a confirmation that the Protestant Reformation came with something similar that blurs our numbers. So the answer is yes and no, maybe mostly yes, that we confirm that these values are important.
So what did you find most exciting about your research? What kept you going? I guess you must have worked on this for several years. What kept the energy going?
With this project, I just find it extremely exciting that we can reveal something so distinct about these monks established 900 years ago. It's almost like going back in time or doing detective work. We reveal these mechanisms and effects of things in our past that the people of the past cannot tell us, but we can see in the data that this must be true. And then I'm also excited by the fact that we can look into some of these theories by our great scholars of the past, for example, Max Weber, to examine whether, because at the time of Max Weber, he didn't have the econometric tools that we have today. So it's exciting to be able to contribute and to test whether some of his ideas, whether we can find the same in the data.
I keep saying that economic historians are like the modern Indiana Jones. I keep saying that in every episode, but it's true. Like if you hear all the stories of all the authors that we interviewed so far. They go back in time. They just dig archives. It's fascinating. So on these line, what other research are you working on? What other projects?
So in general, I am fascinated about this idea of going back to the roots. Actually, I have a story of my initial inspiration to enter this field entirely. I know the exact book that got me hooked. I studied in Canada at the time, and on the curriculum was Jared Diamond's Guns, Germs, and Steel. I remember studying hard for the exam on this secluded beach on Vancouver Island, and I was just completely engulfed by this amazing book that raised more questions in my brain than it actually answered. And yeah, it's fascinated, and I've been preoccupied by finding the roots of economic development ever since. I've studied institutions, geography, culture, but lately, the past a decade or so, I've studied religion. I find religion extremely fascinating. I don't really understand every aspect of religion. I don't think anybody does, because religion has so many dimensions, and you can imagine in theory that religion affects so many aspects of society, both good and bad. And then that's why I think that's also, I think, the reason why this field, economics of religion, has spurred lately, with many scholars looking at differences across. So here we are looking at differences across types of religion, like Cistercian monks versus others. I've been really fascinated also about looking at the degrees of religiosity. So whether, for example, development or gender roles or other outcomes, whether they differ across intensities of religious beliefs, and why some believe more than others. Look at natural disasters that increase religiosity across the globe. So I think this is what I'll be doing for many years to come.
Wonderful.
Sascha, you want to add something on that? You guys are working on similar projects, right?
Well, in fact, Jeanet hopefully will join Monash later this year as a visiting scholar for about a year, one academic year, and I hope we will have lots of opportunities to continue to talk about religion and economics and how it feeds into economic growth and development. So thank you so much, Jeanet. That was wonderful. Thank you for joining us today.
For running the interview. Thank you, Jeanet, for being here with us today. And I hope to have you in the future for your next project. I'm sure it's going to be amazing. And I'll see you guys at the next episode. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.